Hi, my name is Annabella, and today I'll be covering with you social learning theory. Social learning theory is a framework that explains how people acquire, maintain, and change behavior through learning processes. Together, we're going to answer 4 key questions. What does the theory say? What does the research say about the theory? How does the theory fit within the field of social work? And whether or not I would use this theory in practice and why. We're going to integrate insights from several sources, including scholars, some of which you may recognize as Albert Bandura, B.F. Skinner, Bruce A. Thayer, Laura L. Myers, Shannon Deaton, and Fermenza and Sapullo. So, what does the theory say? Social learning theory proposes that many human problems arise not necessarily from mysterious internal forces alone, but because behavior is learned and maintained through interaction with our environment. The theory combines ideas from cognitive psychology and behavioral science. As explained by Fermenza and Sapullo, social learning theory blends behavioral learning mechanisms such as reinforcement or punishment with cognitive processes such as attention, memory, and expectation. In other words, it's not necessarily what we see that matters, but what's important is how we process it and how we interpret it. Behavioral theorists such as B.F. Skinner focused on operant conditioning, which is the idea that consequences shape behavior. Skinner emphasized that behaviors are strengthened when they're followed by things like rewards and weakened by things like punishments. Bandura radically expanded this by showing that people can learn simply just by observing others without direct consequences like Skinner thought. Bandura has a famous experiment that I'm sure many of you might be familiar with, but we're going to get into that a little bit later on. Fermenza and Sapullo stress that observational learning, which is also called modeling, is central to social learning theory. People don't have to do something to learn it, but they can learn by watching a model and mentally processing what they observe. As Thayer and Myers explained, behavior includes, quote, observable activity, measurable physiological changes, cognitive images, fantasies, and emotions, end quote. Problems can develop when people learn maladaptive thoughts or behaviors through poor modeling or reinforcement patterns. Social learning theory suggests that the way to help people is by changing learning conditions. If a behavior is learned, then we can assume it can also be unlearned or redirected. Social learning theory doesn't only focus on changing thoughts or insights, but it focuses on altering environments and consequences so that adaptive behaviors become more likely and the problematic ones are less reinforced. According to Thayer and Myers, intervention focuses on modeling adaptive behavior, reinforcing desired behavior, reducing reinforcement for maladaptive responses, and using structured practice and skill rehearsal. The therapeutic relationship isn't dismissed, but instead becomes functional. The practitioner might act as a model, a guide in processing experiences, and as a source of reinforcement or feedback. Cognitive elements remind us that internal processes such as expectations and self-efficacy also play a role in how learning translates into behavior. In researching social learning theory, I found that it has strong empirical support, particularly in observational learning. A classic demonstration, I told you we'd come back to it, is Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. In this study, children aged 3 to 6 were exposed to adults who either behaved aggressively towards a doll, behaved non-aggressively, or children who were not exposed to an adult who acted one way or another at all. Children were mildly frustrated and then observed for aggressive behavior. The results of the study were undeniable. Children who observed aggressive models were significantly more likely to imitate aggressive behavior, frequently replicating exact actions and phrases. In contrast, about 70% of children in the non-aggressive and control groups showed no imitative aggression. Boys tended to imitate physical aggression more than girls, especially when the model was male, which is interesting because this reflects cultural expectations about gender and aggression. These findings challenge earlier views, such as the psychoanalytic idea that watching aggression provides a safe outlet, or B.F. Skinner's emphasis on reinforcement alone. Bandura's work showed that simply observing a behavior can be enough for learning. Research since then has generally supported the main ideas of social learning theory. Fermenza and Sapullo explain that learning is not passive. People must attend to, encode, retain, and reproduce behaviors, and that they're more likely to imitate models they find relevant or rewarding. Other research supports the idea of self-efficacy, which is the belief in one's ability to perform a task as a strong predictor of behavior change. Critiques of the theory point out some limitations, which I do think is important to mention, such as underestimating emotional and biological factors, or even overemphasizing observable behavior. However, at the end of the day, the theory's emphasis on observable processes and measurable outcomes has made it valuable in both research and practice. I believe social learning theory fits well with the core values and frameworks of social work, especially the person in environment perspective. This perspective emphasizes that an individual's behavior and well-being are inseparable from their surrounding environments, including but not limited to family, work, community, and culture. Unlike theories that locate problems only within the individual, social learning theory emphasizes the dynamic interaction between a person and their context. As Skinner noted, quote, "Men act upon the world and change it and are then changed in turn by the consequences of their action," end quote. Thayer and Myers argue that while ecological and systems perspectives help social workers conceptualize problems, social learning theory grounds those perspectives in observable learning processes that practitioners can then influence. For social workers, this means recognizing that problematic behavior is often learned, understanding how reinforcement and modeling influences our clients, and using practical strategies like skill building, feedback, and contingency management. For Mensah and Sapullo's inclusion of cognitive elements adds some depth to the theory, reminding us that internal expectations, attention, and retention affect how learning translates into behavior. I found some really intriguing research by Shannon Deaton regarding social media, and I feel like this really further expands the theory's relevance, especially in our digital age. Deaton argued that platforms like Facebook and Instagram act as social environments in themselves where observational learning is constant. Social media captures attention, boosts memory through multimedia, and shapes motivation and self-efficacy through feedback loops. I don't know about you, but I can definitely relate to this myself. Deaton's research showed us that social learning theory isn't just about face-to-face environment, but it can also apply to digital environments where clients spend a lot of time, especially when working with today's youth. Given social work's growing engagement with technology, identity development, and community influences, social learning theory offers a timely and flexible framework to apply to our field. Would I use this theory in practice? Absolutely. As an outreach caseworker, I use social learning theory every single day. My position involves regular engagement with children, families, schools, and community programs where things like modeling, reinforcement pattern, and social engagement are central to change. Much of my work is surrounded by assisting DCF-involved children and families meet goals centralized in stabilization within the home and improvement of negative behaviors both in the home and in the community. Social learning theory helps me understand how my client's environment impacts their behavior, and further, what techniques should I use to help them best in their treatment plan. I can appreciate that the theory focuses on observable and measurable processes. It recognizes the influence of environment and not just the individual pathology of a client. It offers clear intervention strategies, including modeling, reinforcement, and skill building. It integrates both behavioral and cognitive elements, and it applies to traditional and digital social contexts. It's also helpful to combine this theory with trauma-informed or strength-based approaches to ensure attention to emotional and systemic dynamics, especially with our clients coming from vulnerable populations. But overall, social learning theory provides a practical, humane, and evidence-supported way to help clients change towards healthier behavior. Just some closing thoughts from Bandura's Bobo doll experiment to Deaton's social media insights. Social learning theory reminds us that people learn from the world around them and that the world around them shapes what they learn. For social work, that makes this theory both relevant and powerful as a bridge between understanding and intervention. Thanks for listening to this digital review of social learning theory. In the comments are the sources used to provide you with this exceptional information. Have a good night, and I hope you learned something new.